Hi, I'm Claire Mitchell, QC. Welcome to the Witches of Scotland podcast. I'm a lawyer who specialises in miscarriage of justice cases, and we're bringing you this podcast because we want to tell you about the women who were accused, prosecuted, convicted, and ultimately executed as witches in Scotland.
I'm Zoe Venditozzi, and I'm a writer who's always had an interest in the witches, and I feel that this dark mark against Scotland needs a reckoning.
The campaign Witches of Scotland wants three things. Firstly, a pardon for all those convicted of witchcraft. Secondly, an apology for all those who were accused as witches. And finally, a national monument in recognition of all those who are affected by this terrible miscarriage of justice.
Over the forthcoming weeks, we'll be talking to a whole host of experts about the history and the modern day connections to the Witches of Scotland.
Hello and welcome to episode 2 of Witches of Scotland podcast.
This week, Claire and I were delighted to speak to Sara Sheridan. Sara is a renowned author, activist and public campaigner. Her 2019 book, Where Are the Women?, takes an unflinching look at Scotland's heritage, reimagining the historic sites of Scotland so that women have their rightful place.
Sorry about the sound quality in this episode. With coronavirus restrictions preventing us from meeting in person, we're conducting our interviews online. At one point, you'll even hear a brief contribution from my dogs, Redford and Crombie. We begin by asking Sara what her inspiration for writing Where Are the Women was.
I had written a short story for a book that tied in with the Bloody Scotland Festival, which was commissioned by Historic Environment Scotland. I think it was 12 or 15 crime writers, because I write a crime series set in the 50s. And I had written a short story to go in this book, which was based in a Historic Environment Scotland property. And I went on a tour with some of the other writers into various properties to do events. And I was in these historic environment properties, and when I got home, I met the publisher of the book, the editor that had commissioned it. And I said to him, "Where are the women? I was around all these castles, all these places, and there's no female stories. What's going on?" And we had a coffee, and he kind of went off, and I thought, oh, he hates me now for being a bit of a feminist, and he'll never speak to me again. And then about 2 weeks later, he rang me and he went, "You know what? You're totally right. I went and I checked, and we don't have enough. Do you want to do something?" And we had both seen, actually, in the New Yorker project by Rebecca Solnit, writer Rebecca Solnit, who had renamed a number of stops on the New York subway after women to tell the story of New York. And Jamie just said to me, "Oh, why don't you do that?" And I had this vision in my mind initially of doing the Glasgow subway. I just wasn't particularly ambitious, but Jamie was, and he said, "You could just do the whole country." And I remember this kind of moment of thinking, oh my God, how would I do that? That's a massive, massive job. And then just coming out of my mouth, just saying, yeah, no problem, I'll do that. That's great. I'd love to do that. Just fire ahead and commission it. And then this panic of like 3 days where there was virtually no sleep, or sort of sitting up, figuring out how to create this imagined guidebook to the whole country.
How long, Sara, did it actually take you to get the whole book together?
It's pretty quick. I mean, I don't dilly-dally when I'm writing. I am quite relatively fast. And so I think we had that conversation in February, commissioned the book straight away, and I think I delivered it in the August. But it was a kind of mad research project, and there were maps all over my study and piles of biographies of different women. And, he was very sort of, he would have allowed me to do whatever I wanted. He basically said, look, if you want to do the stories of 50 women, you fire ahead. But the more I looked at it, the more I thought one of the misconceptions is that the women are not commemorated because there just aren't enough stories. There just aren't that many who achieve things. And so very quickly, my maxim became no lady left behind. I became like this mad campaigner. I was absolutely raging. I kept finding all these stories. And normally as a novelist, I work within 2 different historical periods. So I was really excited to find material that, predated like the witches and post-dated these 2 periods and fill in the gaps almost. It was a very different kind of research, but it was kind of a 15 or 16-hour a day job pretty much between February and August.
Brilliant. And as you say, it covers the whole of Scotland. I like the Old Lady of Hoy.
I think a lot of people responded to that kind of thing because it hits you immediately that you have an assumption. So I also made Fife a queendom rather than a kingdom. And a lot of people were like, oh, right, yeah, of course, why do we do that? And I think that was really one of the sort of purposes of the book, was to make people think, oh, actually, our real world is gendered in an incredible extent towards the other gender, towards the dominant gender, the male gender. And actually, when you start doing that the other way around, it highlights that issue. You suddenly sitting there thinking, oh yeah, why is it called a kingdom? And why do we have an old man of Hoy and not an old lady of Hoy? And why is our national monument in Stirling a man and not a woman? Because, we are ignoring systematically and not commemorating a really amazing part of our cultural legacy. And it's the female part.
There's a real parallel between your book and what you're talking about, and about this idea that women are sort of invisible and that it's men that we think about all the time, with the story of the witches. Because although I grew up in Scotland and I was aware that there were witches in Scotland, it's not something that's really in our history, or not in a real sort of tangible, that these are individuals sort of manner. What do you think about that?
I think that's absolutely pervasive. And I think, we do have stories of women. We do have women who are high in public profile and have throughout history had women who are consistently famous, actually. But it's the way that we process the memory of that and almost knit it into our history. And that's a huge process. I mean, it's about how artifacts collections are collated. It's about material in libraries, for example. It's about lots of things. And it's also about a kind of cultural bias that we have towards honouring what men have done and just assuming that, we can sort of forget the women. And it goes on today. I remember on the anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, listening to a number of radio programmes, and it was BBC programming. I think it was going on all day. And it was 2:00 in the afternoon before anybody mentioned Mo Mowlam. And she was the architect of the Good Friday Agreement. And all the big players have been on, Gordon Brown had been on, and Tony Blair had been on, and they'd all been talking about, what a fantastic agreement this was. And then I think it was Mo Mowlam's son-in-law rang in and basically said, what about Mo Mowlam? And everyone went, oh yeah, right. Oh yeah, she was and it's just something we do within our culture. We have this tendency to forget women and not only the achievement, but also the tremendous suffering. And for me, what Claire has come up with, the idea of this national monument, the male monuments that we have to male victimhood are war memorials.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
They are the victims of the state, in a sense, the men who died in the war. And women are not notated routinely on war memorials, or haven't been until very recently. So certainly World War I war memorials, for example, don't tend to include any of the female names. And that is the case, in Scotland, we had the Scottish Women's Hospitals, and we had many, many women who volunteered and went off to run the hospitals in Serbia, in France, all over Belgium. As well, and some of these women died, and they're not included on the war memorials where their brothers are.
I didn't realise that.
I didn't want to admit that in public, but I didn't realise that women did die during the First World War in conflict.
Oh my goodness. It was absolutely massive. So we just had Elsie Ingalls, who's a Scottish doctor from Edinburgh, marched up to Edinburgh Castle, gotten hold of the colonel in charge and said to him, I want to go and set up some hospitals to help in this war. And he said, dear lady, go home and sit still. Elsie went home, rallied a whole load of her female doctor friends, went to the French government. The French government gave them a grant, and they set up a number of these hospitals. And the headquarters was in St Andrew Square in Edinburgh. And they saved literally thousands upon thousands upon thousands of lives. And it was staffed by women. It was female doctors. It was female nurses. It's called the Scottish Women's Hospitals. And we have no major monument. I mean, this is your next job, Claire.
No, I was thinking, Sarah, I see a whole new campaign starting ahead of you.
And these women are not on war memorials. Their brothers are. The men who died are. They are not. And that is an injustice quite as much as witches who were victims of the state, victims of religious intolerance, victims of social intolerance in many cases as well. We need those kind of monuments as well, because it's part of painting our history in the whole. And we're missing, half the story all the way through. It's crazy.
I think the recent Black Lives Matter events and people pulling down statues that didn't properly represent the past was a really, really powerful symbol that people are no longer willing to accept a history that's just given to them without challenge anymore. I thought that was a really powerful thing to have happened recently, and I hope it does signify that people are more interested in showing in public spaces the true history.
The Black Lives Matter protested the statue in St Andrew's Square of Henry Melville. And that statue hasn't come down, but recently they've put up an explanation next to the statue to talk about his role within the slave trade and perpetuating the slave trade, in fact. And he's a very, blackened figure, really. I mean, he's very controversial. I don't know how much you know about it and how much we need to go into it on a podcast that's essentially about witchcraft, but I would love to see that statue come down. We need to free up some of the spaces in our, in Edinburgh, we have just so many spaces that are taken over by male statues of people who, for one reason or another, just really shouldn't be there. And we need to start looking at that with a kind of more honest eye, because statutory and street names and things are about honouring the memory. They're not just about telling our history. And we shouldn't be honouring those memories.
For me, it's really interesting with the witches is to open up that whole sort of public concept of who the witches were, that they weren't just this kind of massive old women with warts and pointy hats, that they were actually just lots and lots of women, and some men too, obviously, who were caught in the trap of this sort of really hideous kind of social movement. We saw you, of course, down at Couris for the commemoration event for Lilias. And I was wondering if you could maybe tell us a bit more about the Lilias story that we briefly touched on last episode.
I love Lilias. I mean, some of the witches' stories stand out. There were over 3,000 women died in Scotland, and we don't know all of their stories, but there are a few that, really stand out. And what I love about Lilias, she was an older woman. She died in 1704. She was taken to the Kirk Sessions, the church, and she was questioned. She was tortured for probably around a month, and they questioned her and questioned her and questioned her. And she admitted all kinds of things, including having sex with the devil and the devil coming to visit and all kinds of stuff. But they were constantly pressing her to give up the names of other witches in her coven. And she wouldn't do that. She gave them the names of women that they already had, but she wouldn't give them anyone new. And that probably extended her torture, but it meant that she didn't spread that fear any further. And sadly, Lilias died before she could be convicted. And so she's one of the only, in fact, I think she is the only witch's grave that we have because her body was never burned. They buried her at the shoreline because they were so afraid she would rise from the dead and come to seek revenge. And the shoreline where the tide comes in is traditionally an area that it's difficult for spirits to cross. And so she was buried on the beach near where she lived at Torryburn.
I didn't realise that was part of the thinking of where to bury her. I mean, I realised they took her out to the shore and they put her in a box and they locked the box and then they put the enormous slab of stone over her. But I didn't realise that was a particular reason that they put her there in the water.
Yeah, it's like a superstition. Spirits can't cross that. That's a sort of in between two worlds place, if you like.
Isn't it remarkable? It was driven supposedly by Christianity, but at the same time, sort of, it was the church that were very involved in it, obviously. But then to have such pagan idea is really remarkable.
Yeah, I mean, it's groupthink. The church at this point in history, they believe they're doing a good thing. And people often say, oh, do you really believe in the witches? Did they really believe that? They must have just been out to settle scores or whatever. But no, they did really believe it. And they believed it was their duty. People had that absolute, complete burning belief that if they didn't try and execute witches, then terrible things would happen. God would come and wreak havoc upon them for not sort of looking after society by naming and punishing these people. And so, it's quite easy when you're looking backwards to look backwards through all the things that you know and you learned. You see this quite often as a historical novelist. People think, weren't they so stupid in the Victorian era not to have invented penicillin? Of course they hadn't invented penicillin. If you hadn't invented penicillin, we also believe that, weird things like, if you put tobacco up your bottom, it would help with your cancer or whatever. All kinds of weird medical medical things. And it's the same with this. We live in a world where, people are still superstitious, but superstitions were, I think, much more real. People were looking for order and desperately in a kind of fairly chaotic world. And we forget how dangerous the world was in the medieval era.
That was because King James really legitimised the whole thing, though, wasn't it? That was because he became obsessed and then wrote the book in demonology, and everyone from nobility down had, as you described it quite rightly, a burning belief, quite literally, in the cases of these poor women, that people who were beholden to the devil were amongst us.
But remember, he was taken away. He was inducted by John Knox himself until the age of about 7 or 8. And John Knox, a massive misogynist, absolutely hated Mary Queen of Scots, James's mother, and demonised her to this very young child. And so this idea of, Scottish women being evil, Scottish women being out to get things and do evil things, I sort of feel like there's a whole Freudian analysis of James, which is yet to be undertaken almost. And I wrote an essay, actually, which I haven't done anything with yet, called We Are All Witches, which is about this process of demonising women so that there is no way out. And we see this today. We see it often online. We see it in newspapers. We see the way that our media deal with women. And there is a sense in which, that witchcraft mentality kind of lives on in this country. And of course, it lives on for real in other places in the world, in Africa and in India, where there are still witchcraft trials go on and people are still executed.
And that's something we're going to be covering in one of our future episodes. We've got an expert who will be talking to us about the experiences in the country in which he works, but we'll reveal that in time.
Oh, how exciting.
How would you like to see the witches memorialised? Have you had any thoughts about how that might look?
Oh, I mean, I think about memorials for women all the time. In Where Are the Women, I had some individual monuments to witches, but I made a national monument, which was in a burnt out church in the middle of the countryside. The church exists, actually. And it was a trail that you would follow to the church. And then this church would have inside it all kinds of herbs that were put around the walls. And I worked with a perfume consultant, Alex Musgrave, who gave me ideas for which herbs would work well together in a damp ruined church, which smelt of charcoal because it had been burnt out. Like an amazing monument, like a totally sensual monument. And I quite often, when I look back as far as the witches, smell is where I go, because it's a sense that hasn't changed. It's an aesthetic that hasn't changed. We still think that the same stuff smells good or smells stimulating. And so that in my imagined monument to the witches was a burnt out church with a lot of herbs in it, where you could go and commune with that spirit of these sort of fallen women.
That sounds absolutely amazing. It sounds, doesn't it? It's so clever. Just drawn to the idea of it. But it's not your first foray into scent and witches, is it, Sarah?
No, my daughter and I founded together a perfume company in 2016, which we actually only closed earlier this year. It's our 4-year project to look at commemorating women through scent. And we had 2 scents that we brought out. We almost brought out a third, but we were halted in our tracks by politics and events and things. And the first one was called Damn Rebel Bitches, which was in memory of the Jacobite women. And the second was a scent to the witches. And working with a perfumer for the witches, we wanted to use scents that would have really made sense to the women of that era in their lives. So we used hazelnut, and we used blood orange, these things that were almost like luxuries at the time. And hazelnut was a very staple food, and we wanted to make it smell green. We wanted to make it smell of outdoors and of animal. So we had a kind of leather scent to it, a tobacco, so that it would smell kind of green and of, even cities during the medieval era were actually, today we would consider them pretty rural in many ways. There were animals about, there was, people growing stuff everywhere. So, we wanted to create a scent that sort of commemorated them through smells that they would have recognized as part of their lives. And of course, malt, because so many women were brewers. And there is a whole theory of study that the witches were part of the witchcraft sort of mentality, was men taking over the brewing industry, victimizing women who had these sort of tall hats, which were the uniform, if you like, of the brewer, the tall hat with the broom. If you had brewed and you had fresh ale, you would hang out a broom outside your cottage and people could buy that ale. And so a lot of the iconography around the witches actually ties in with iconography around medieval women who were brewing.
We would love to get a medieval historian to come and talk to us more about that. I think you've already did that in your investigations, didn't you, Sarah?
Yeah, we did. We had a blog called Bitches Unite. Lots of people came on Bitches Unite and wrote about the beauty industry and the way that it shows women's bodies, and wrote about the perfume industry and how wasteful and unsustainable it usually is, and wrote about women's history as well. So we had a really interesting mix of women who were historians and academics, activists and politicians and things, who were all kind of involved in giving their view. And the writer that wrote that piece, I think, was doing a PhD actually on it. So there's definitely people out there with the smarts to come on and chat to you.
Well, we definitely are following in your footsteps.
It's such an endlessly fascinating subject, you know, the fact that we're talking about the witches, but then we're talking, you know, more broadly about social history and about the way that people lived in the medieval times and the way the church was.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the problem is with such short periods of time that we have on podcasts, we could definitely take any of these conversations and make them into several different podcasts. So I do hope, Sara, that you will come back and speak to us again as the campaign continues, because I definitely think we want to go into some more of the detail about female visibility in public places and about what it means to have a position in the world and how we properly record history going forward so that the women's place is central to it.
A big thanks to Sara Sheridan for joining us this week. I hope you found that discussion as fascinating as we did, and we're certainly hoping to have Sara back on in the future as the project develops. Thanks so much for being here, and please tune in next time for episode 3. Can you say tuning in? I feel like the old tidiness of that.
Do set your radio cassette recorder to record our readings.
I think we still need to have...
If you'd like to learn more about the Witches of Scotland, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Sign up for our mailing list at www.witchesofscotland.com to keep updated with the campaign. On that site, you'll be able to find how to link with us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.